point that I think isn't appreciated enough or maybe brought up enough in policy circles is that when you have very, very large shocks to a sector like the manufacturing sector experienced in the 2000s, those are fundamentally different than the kinds of changes over longer periods of time on the margin to what's done here versus what's done overseas. When you have employment in manufacturing dropping by a third, the number of factories closing by over, I think it was on the order of 20% in a matter of years, that has, you have a tremendous destruction of both physical capital and human capital that can send regional economies into a downward spiral that can take a generation or more to recover from. Those sorts of things need to be taken into account when we're developing trade policy. I think that the biggest problem from my perspective with the strong form narrative, that I'll call it, that it was really all this job loss and for decades and including mostly in the 2000s, was just about automation, right? The problem with that is that it kind of stifled an intelligent debate about trade and trade policy that we needed to have long ago. And what the consequences of trade is for our economy. It's not whether you want to trade, whether you want to close the borders or not. Of course, there's benefits to everyone. I think it's more a matter of the pace. And when things happen so fast that they cause massive disruptions, that's where the problem can be. And when we didn't diagnose that correctly, we didn't have an important policy conversation that we needed to have.
Well, what's interesting about that is that people on the left and the right now have decided that trade was has been an enormous punisher of certain types of skill levels and certain geographic areas. And even if whether they misinterpreted the manufacturing data or not at this point, I don't think is so important. There's a growing consensus, I think somewhat correct but somewhat wrong. I'll try to outline which is which, that the expanded trade with China and the rest of the world has been very damaging to certain areas and certain types of people. Now, part of that obviously is true, and part of it is exactly for the reasons you said and I alluded to earlier, which is the speed of that adjustment was quite large. But I want to go back to what you said, and I want to give you my version and let you react to it. You said there are winners and losers in trade. I would say it a little differently. I would say there are winners and losers from economic change in the short run. That's been true since human beings began to have any dynamism in their choices in life. It's a part of capitalism. It's part of creative destruction. And so for me, what's important, among other things, is the fact that over time, standard of living rises steadily from the two things we're talking about today, trade and innovation, trade and the application of technology. The challenge is, what do we do about the fact that not everyone gains at every point in time? And there's a growing feeling among folks that we have to do something about that. Either dial back how open our economy is to trade, which would also imply, I think, dialing back something about how innovative our economy is and how much technological change we allow. Because even if I accept your story, Susan, which I think I do, that the technological gains from in manufacturing are not as important as I may have thought, they are happening elsewhere. Software is eating the world in many places, many parts of the economy. So I don't want to dial that back. I don't want to dial back trade. What I want to do is make it easier for people to transition to something different. Now, that may be a fantasy. That may be easy for me to say because I have a good life. But I think the way we have made it hard for people to move to cities where there's often more employment from rural areas that have vibrant manufacturing sectors and now have lost those. I think it's a terrible tragedy, but we've compounded it by making it hard for people to find new opportunities. So what are your thoughts on that?
Right. So you're getting into a whole other line of research that takes place here at the Upjohn Institute for Employment Research, which is whether it's coming from trade, technology, or something else. There is a sense that change is occurring rapidly, and that the workforce needs to have continued, education and skills development, lifelong learning, as it were. And how do we set up systems to deal with that? So I think that's right. I largely agree with you on that score. And that's we can't bury our heads in the sand and dial back to 1950 when the U.S. was so dominant in manufacturing coming out of World War II. That's not going to happen. We do, I think, just to reiterate something I said earlier, we do want to think about how quickly we adopt policies or adopt policies that may lead to very rapid disruptive change that may overwhelm regional economies and so forth, or at least have systems in place to programs in place, supports in place to facilitate that adjustment. Because as I said earlier, one thing that we do know from economic history, one of the most robust results in labor economics is that when you have large-scale displacements, it can take a regional economy a generation to recover. So if we're in a world